Welcome to today's DCRI Research Conference. Happy New Year. We have a really great presentation today. Adrian, Lesley, and Kevin really know how to pack a house. They're going to talk about something obviously that's of strong interest to everyone. We've heard a little bit about pragmatic trials, but today we'll hear about it from the perspective of the Healthcare System Research Collaboratory. Remarkable effort. Look forward to hearing about this effort from a dynamic trio who needs no introduction. So please join me in welcoming them today.
All right. Okay, so congratulations, everyone. You're keeping your New Year's resolutions to attend a research conference and get your CME credit. So what we're going to do here today is just talk about where we stand in terms of the Collaboratory at its kind of midpoint. So the Collaboratory is a roadmap initiative from the NIH to actually try to think about how to transform research, clinical trials, and rethink research and doing things more pragmatically and fitting and generating knowledge that will have a major impact on care. So here are the topics that we're going to discuss. And so since it's a new year and we have all sorts of freedom to do whatever we want, would put together a few resolutions for the group, as well as some predictions here for 2016. Then we'll talk a little bit about what's the Collaboratory trying to do, how we're doing it, what we've learned, what have we created, and also think about what should we do next, and also get some input of what people think here would be really ripe for pragmatic trials and leveraging this national research to develop new approaches and disseminate new approaches of doing pragmatic trials. So, anyone here have a New Year's resolution? Raise your hand. No one. Okay. So I guess the first one that I know everyone had was to be more honest, because I know everyone had some New Year resolutions. And so if you actually go and look at data, it turns out that people make the same New Year's resolutions every year. And this comes out of what are the top 10 resolutions that people say. Interestingly enough, there is this phenomenon that people make New Year's resolutions and then break them within 30 days. And people have that insight between the ages of 4 and 6. The reason I know that is when I asked my 6-year-old what his New Year's resolution was going to be, and my 4-year-old, the 4-year-old didn't really know what kind of impact that had or what that meant. The 6-year-old clearly understood that, like, this was going to be something, that a behavior that he was going to have to improve upon, and he wanted nothing with that. And so he said he wasn't going to have anything to do with that. And then the 4-year-old, well, he didn't understand the concept, and so when he was asking, what it meant, explaining to him what it meant, then he got that, yes, he needs to do something better. And so what he decided to do was he was going to eat more chocolate. And so he thought that would actually improve health and also improve the economy, apparently. And so that was his new resolution. Yeah. So, and I actually had some good ones for our kind of team on Collaboratory. But right before the conference, I was threatened not to disclose any of them, being reminded that one person has a black belt and another one played right guard in football. I will not disclose who those people were, but that's the threat there. So a few predictions here for 2016. And you can find all sorts of good information on the web, Twitter, etc. And it's interesting to see some of the common themes that come up regarding predictions for 2016 in healthcare and research. And so common ones that I found doing a very quantitative way of Google searching was this idea about patients and engagement. And that there's going to be a lot of emphasis regarding partnership with patients. It's been around for several years, and so it certainly has been center to PCORI, but we're seeing that across different entities. And so if anyone's noticed the new Precision Medicine Initiative from the White House that's going to be directed by the NIH, that has patient-centeredness all throughout it. Similarly, you've seen some things that have come out from the FDA, again, emphasizing patients growing as partners here. So I think this is going to be something that continues to grow here as we go forward. Then the concept of digital medicine in terms of what are things that are coming up to change kind of our bag of tricks to something for the future. And we're seeing this also with ideas that are emerging not only here at DCRI, but also through the concepts of these pragmatic studies. Like how can we take advantage of encounters and data that's being generated by patients as they walk through their healthcare journey? And soon we'll hopefully be able to actually test some of that through these different pragmatic studies and or pilot them out in our own work here. If you look at kind of the estimates of these tools to measure quality of life and clinical indicators, they're being considered for use every day. And so I'm sure there's some people here who got Fitbits for Christmas or have something like that or know someone like that. But the estimates for wearables and health technology is to grow over $6 billion in the next year. Some other predictions found on the web is this concept again about population-based models of care. So it's no secret that when Gene Washington came through, he emphasized this in an important way. And one of the things that he's probably noticed is that if you look at the current estimates of healthcare systems, payers organizing themselves into ACOs, that is estimated to continue to grow significantly, not just part of the Affordable Care Act, but because of other payer interests currently. And so we're starting to see these different partnerships that come across, not only within those health systems, but also bringing other partners into play, so laboratory partnerships. Partnerships with the Walgreens and CVS's of the U.S. What this allows then is actually starting to think about systems of care, health systems that actually are going to be uniting different aspects that actually could be doing research. And so one kind of foundational aspect of the Collaboratory is actually pulling together different types of healthcare systems or more than one healthcare system to answer questions. And so this is something that we should keep an eye on as things go forward. And so just the kind of estimates in terms of investments and startups and M&As for this is estimated around $50 billion. We're certainly seeing this where pharmaceutical companies are interested in shifting from volume of drugs to actually value. And so there are actually even people thinking about risk-based contracts where they're going to put forward contracts to deliver a drug to an organization with some payment terms that actually would depend on actually improving population health. And so that is something, again, playing into this concept of people needing these different health systems to actually address questions and or building into a complete outcome ascertainment. And then I think some of us hope that in a week from now that there'll be a positive vote at the Senate Help Committee for one of our former colleagues, Rob Califf. And certainly we're starting to see, as the FDA has started recently putting out more proclamations of getting towards big data, that there's a strong interest in terms of driving evidence generation for leveraging these types of systems or more integrated approaches for healthcare and how you can repurpose that for evidence generation. So certainly we'll be aware of whenever there's big data, we should be the hammer that's thinking about how to generate that into answers. So all these reasons, I think many of us here in this room probably would agree that we are at this tipping point, and whether hopefully we don't die from trying to push the rock up the hill, but we do sit in this kind of central aspect of being around all these different issues and being able to really think about how can we tip what we've done before to something that can have a major impact with delivery of real-world evidence in pragmatic trials. And there are additional reasons to really think about this, and this has been highlighted by Mike Lauer, who is now in charge of $21 billion of funding for extramural research at the NIH. And he pulled his information from unusual sources, but you can already see that this will be something that, from his standpoint at the NIH, as they think about their $2 billion portfolio in clinical trials, how can they get more bang for the buck? And an example of that is from an unusual source, but from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that has taken a review of clinical research and what's the price index for doing that now for clinical trials. And what they were showing is that there is this concept of trial hyperinflation that relative to everything else in research and development, the costs on a per patient basis for a clinical trial is continue to rise at a greater increase than the overall biomedical research and development costs. And so that is something that's not sustainable, and from an economic point of view, people really look at this as a need for transformation. When you look at this in more detail, this comes from a variety of work, but this shows that, again, the average site in terms of what it has to do continues to grow. And then the question is, are we getting anything back for that extra effort? And the answer is no. So the extra effort then translates into less participants in our trials, and then that translates into slower delivery of evidence into practice. And this was highlighted by a section in HHS called ASPE, and they published a report in 2014 that examined these trial costs, and those figures are pulled from that. And I would encourage anyone to look at this to get an understanding of what organizations like NIH, FDA, or CMS may consider as they start thinking about the future of clinical trials, because a lot of the information that's going to power what their thinking is in terms of policy and approaches is from this report. And kind of key things that they highlighted was the use of lower cost facilities or structures for doing trials, wider use of mobile technologies and also electronic systems for data capture, use of electronic health records, but importantly, simplified protocols. The interesting thing is that they actually calculate different costs for these different aspects, and some of which I'm not actually sure where they get them from, but they note that for each of these plus others that there's actually a potential cost reduction. This is a slide that Joe Selby shared with me, who's the executive director of PCORI. And some of you may have seen this because it's been around for a little while. Janet Woodcock at the FDA has used this slide, or has been the one who's promoted it mostly. But there's this interest of developing a national evidence platform for the U.S. and being able to unite all these different funding agencies, including PCORI, for being part of that. And so the concept here, again, is having a common set of common approach towards data, and being able to have different functions such as addressing safety surveillance with Sentinel, which is currently ongoing, but then also to actually generate evidence in terms of what's the right treatment for the right patient. And so this is really trying to unite payers, providers, and other and health systems and registries to generate that evidence. And the thought is actually the evidence will need to actually be done through randomized trials. It can't be observational studies. And you can see that through this type of distributed network, there are a number of ways to consider doing randomized trials. The Collaboratory is an example of a leading edge of that as well. And this is where I think in particular, we want to think about how we can leverage the experience at DCRI for what's going to be probably a call to the nation in terms of having a national evidence generation system. So let me turn it over to Kevin, who's going to talk about what the Collaboratory is trying to do. And we'll go to Dan's today.
Thank you. Oops. And so, with that context, the Collaboratory's basic vision is to strengthen the national capacity to implement these cost-effective, large-scale research studies that engage healthcare delivery organizations as research partners. And part of the way to build that capacity is to generate the knowledge and tools that would allow more people to conduct this kind of research. And so, Adrian and Lesley and I went up to NIH in June and talked with our NIH colleagues a bit about who we were trying to reach and what we were trying to get. And we identified a bunch of different stakeholders that we put into categories of those who are creating research, like investigators and funders, and those who are consumers of research. And for all of those folks, we looked through and said, well, who are the top priority people we want to focus on with this first round of Collaboratory funding? I say optimistically, because we are anticipating more rounds. And what are the kinds of things that people need to know? And so across the top, we've got if and when to do a pragmatic trial, how to do a trial, which is really where we're focusing now in terms of design, assessing the likelihood of success or impact, conduct, reporting, and then what would markers of quality be for these types of trials, and how might people be helped in disseminating the results and implementing those. And so this is sort of our roadmap of what we're trying to fill in. And the system that we have created through the Collaboratory for doing this is based on the idea that we've got to start with some demonstration projects in order to sort of collect data about how to do these projects and what sorts of issues come up. And so the data collection from the coordinating center standpoint is the experience we're gleaning from these individual projects. So we've got 10 demonstration projects that include 12 different NIH institutes. They're all around the country, and each project started out with a one-year planning phase during which they worked with the coordinating center, maybe collected some pilot data, and then refined their protocols, and upon approval by NIH, began their implementation phase. And now all the projects are in that implementation phase. So we've got these, a variety of these projects, and we can classify them in different ways, but just roughly it was helpful for us to array them along these two dimensions of sort of the baseline severity of the participants and the kinds of interventions ranging from more operational educational interventions, changing the systems of care, to the more therapeutic and stuff in between. And excuse me, you can see our projects have a reasonable distribution. What was kind of fun when we made this plot, though, is we realized there were hardly any studies really in testing drug A versus drug B, which is exactly the example we tend to use when we're talking about ethics of these studies, sort of the paradigmatic study. We actually don't have that one in the Collaboratory, so that's something to consider for future funding. So we have these demonstration projects, and we've got experiences as these projects are trying to implement these studies. And our goal as a coordinating center is to try to collect these experiences. We have a number of different ways. We've got very active steering committee meetings, teleconferences. We have an issues tracker. And we have several core working groups that are dedicated to specific aspects of conducting these trials, and they represent foci of expertise here at Duke and distributed across the sites that help problem solve. And one of the really interesting things about the Collaboratory is that all of the demonstration project PIs had to be willing to air their dirty laundry, to say, we're having trouble with this. This is not going as we had expected, right? So that we could learn, because the point was to learn about these things happening, not to try to make yourselves look good and impress NIH and pretend that you can do everything perfectly. So it took a little bit of a culture shift, but it happened. It's worked very well. On the basis of these different approaches for getting what's going on, the group has come together to generate a few lessons learned wherever possible to address the challenges that have arisen. And then we try to disseminate those. There's a knowledge repository and living textbook online. There's a Grand Rounds presentations that we do every Friday, shared with PCORnet, and producing guidance documents and manuscripts. And so this is sort of our system for collecting these lessons learned and trying to get them out to folks. And so what have we learned? Adrian, Lesley, and I are going to touch on a few different issues, but I want to offer a few kind of higher level things that cut across all the different domains. One is that pragmatic trials do pose unique challenges. So there were things that are unique to pragmatic trials, distinct from running your typical trial that we're used to doing, right? That's good, because that sort of justifies the entire network. Nothing is plug and play. There was really no aspect of any pragmatic trial where you just stick this in and it's going to work. So, depressing and informative. Remember, I said that each project had this planning phase and then an implementation phase. And what was remarkable was that we all expected there to be challenges in the planning phase, where we're finding out that people's original plans maybe weren't such good ideas and they need to be refined before you launch. Certainly a lot of challenges there, but what's impressed, I think, everyone in the Collaboratory is that even after a very successfully designed product has been implemented and is rolling along, new challenges keep arising. Okay? And those new challenges are requiring continued reliance on the unique expertise of a multidisciplinary group represented by the Coordinating Center and others at NIH. The only constant is change, trite but true here. And in terms of the Collaboratory, there's really two aspects of change that have been very challenging. One being the constant changes in the healthcare systems, right? So you've got different players, there's staff turnover, very difficult to run trials in that setting. The other type of change is very annoying, and it's the stability of the control group. When the control group is an active arm of usual care in natural settings like this, there are all sorts of things going on that you cannot prevent. So one of our PIs said, our control is not controlled. We can't control it. That's a big challenge, right? There are other competing initiatives launched at the healthcare system that will alter the experience of people in the control group, right? And it's maybe unethical to constrain those evolving changes in usual care. So this is a very challenging design and analytic issue. Finally, clinician and health system engagement is really critical at multiple levels. We find that partnerships are required all along, including and especially local engagement. Very small, what sound to some people like small changes in workflow or IT are viewed by other players as massive changes. And so engagement is required to appreciate the relative angst that people are going to associate with different proposed changes. And when we've got these large and diverse healthcare units, it requires a much greater investment in training and retraining as people are turning over. Right? So these are some of the sort of cross-cutting themes of the lessons learned here. And we're going to turn now to a very, very quick and shallow review of some issues by specific topics, starting with the ethics and regulatory issues. And I will say that these have posed some really interesting challenges in just trying to understand what is the same about pragmatic trials and what is different in terms of our ethics and regulatory understandings. There are a number of different issues involved here, including informed consent, defining minimal risk, how does data monitoring done, when is it done, research quality, the research and quality improvement distinction, concern about vulnerable subjects, IRB harmonization about how they're approaching these issues, identifying direct and indirect subjects, all the gatekeepers who were involved in the conduct of these trials, what happens when you have FDA-regulated products that are being used in an off-label way in a trial that is not going for a new indication for that product. There are all sorts of different interventions that are a little bit funky from NIH's perspective. That's not your traditional interventions. And there are concerns about privacy. The Collaboratory Ethics Regulatory Group produced a special issue of Clinical Trials in which there's a separate paper addressing each of these. And that was done in collaboration with the PCORNet Ethics Regulatory gang. And so I encourage you to pick that up. Or tune into the Collaboratory PCORNet Grand Rounds, or about once a month they'll be featuring one of these. We don't have time to go into all the specific details on these. We're happy to discuss. There's time for questions, but let me just turn it over to Lesley here.
Great, thank you. Good, thank you. So just picking up then where Kevin left off, I'll touch on a couple of sort of highlights from work that really is being led by colleagues of ours. So we have the dubious, or the pleasure really, of standing before you and talking about the work that lots of other people have been doing. So the study design and biostats core is led by our own Liz DeLong. She has a great group of folks working with her there. You know, some of these issues Kevin has already mentioned. I'll touch on a few. It goes without saying, I suppose, that pragmatic trials don't equate to simple. Pragmatic does not equal simple in terms of execution, in terms of planning, and certainly in terms of the underlying analytic approach. I know from the study design course perspective, sometimes the real question is, can you use a pragmatic trial approach to answer this question? And oftentimes, or sometimes, the answer is no, because what you're trying to do can't really be tested in that real world environment. Kevin alluded to the challenge of not being able to control the control group. That's a real problem. In terms of the methodological issues that require careful thought, I've listed just a few here that have been highlighted by Liz and her team. Cluster designs are the norm in pragmatic trials. It would seem certainly in the Collaboratory's portfolio, their cluster randomized designs are the norm, and that leads to questions about, like, well, at what unit are you? What's the unit of randomization? What's the cluster to be used in the trial? And then how do you deal with the situation when that unit, that cluster, changes over time? You've randomized at the physician practice level or at some other cluster level, and what happens inevitably when the composition of that changes over time? Randomization scheme. Actually, I think Kevin touched a little bit on this issue of exposure and fidelity to the intervention as well. When you're doing a trial within a health system, lots of things change. Lots of things change that may, in fact, undermine the fidelity of that intervention. That's taken up we spent a lot of time talking about that in both the planning phase and in the execution phase of these trials. And then the forever bugaboo of pragmatic trials, how do you make sure that you've got complete follow-up on these patients, especially when we're relying on electronic health record systems and health system data in general for that follow-up? We worry about that a lot. Just so in the interest of time, I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but the issue of the actual cluster design, that's consumed a lot of time, I think, in the biostats core. And I would direct you to the living textbook and to the Collaboratory website for some guidance documents that the biostats core has put together about this. I talked about the unit of randomization. In most of the proposals initially relied on these large clinical level clusters and inevitably underestimated the sample size required to answer the question at hand. So the real goal is to aim for that smallest unit that you can get to where you don't have the contamination issues that we talked about before. I think some of the trials in the current portfolio are using panel level clusters. Others are using sort of larger clusters, but there's been a real move away from those big clusters that were initially proposed. The issue with when you think about a cluster randomized design, how exactly do you implement that? And there are two options that have been talked about a lot. The stepped wedge design, we were thinking beforehand, I think the stepped wedge design is being used. I can think of at least 2 or 3 that are actively using that, but cluster with crossover is an opportunity as well, where you randomize at the cluster, but then cross over to the other arm midway through. These are all feasible if certain conditions are met, right? So the crossover, you have to be able to turn off that learning or turn off the intervention and turn on something new. The stepped wedge design, it's called stepped wedge because it looks, when you look at how sites come on, how the randomization takes place, it actually looks like a stepping stone. And you're essentially randomizing the timing of when the cluster is turned on to the intervention. Again, I'll point you to some of the great documents that Liz and her team have put on the website about these approaches. So one of the requirements of the funded studies in the Collaboratory was that they leverage electronic health record data in the conduct of their trials. And so this is sort of, I'll just go through quickly some high-level lessons learned that have come out of that work. And these probably won't be a surprise because we've said a lot. We've said these before. No 2 EHRs are alike, and that's even the case when sites are part of a single local corporate entity. ABATE is a trial that is set within the Hospital Corporation of America, where you might think there's homogeneity with respect to the electronic health record systems. Not so. So cross-site data standardization becomes really, really important, and solving those inconsistencies of data across sites, that just takes a lot of time. Local data experts and time, and looking in this crowd, I know that you all know exactly what that work looks like. The more sites you have, the more work it is. So this is not something that somehow magically scales to become an easier problem as you add more sites. The table here is actually not from the Collaboratory, but from a work that we've done in Sentinel, just highlighting the variation in result units that appear in highly standardized laboratory data systems. Following the same theme, because no 2 electronic health record systems are the same, tools don't plug into one necessarily very easily. So the SPOT trial is a suicide prevention trial run by Greg Simon, and their assumption going into it is that if they developed something in one site, they'd be able to just push it into all of the other EPIC sites that they had, and that was pretty quickly proven wrong. To the point that Kevin made earlier, the only way to solve that is to engage IT resources, and finding your way to the top of a priority queue can be a real challenge. We've certainly talked about this lesson learned before in this forum. The EHR is optimized for billing, and we're trying to use it to get research quality data. There's some inherent problems and challenges associated with that. Several of the trials underscored the importance of pilot testing. Try it, make sure it works in all of the environments. I think we've touched on the other issues. There's a glimmer of hope, though. The suicide prevention trial, SPOT, has really been able to use some of the population management capabilities within Epic to serve their trial well. So Greg Simon has been quick to point out the partnership that they've developed with Epic and how they've actually been able to use things to further the research agenda. So next I'll touch briefly on the distributed research network, which is kind of a very different concept in Collaboratory. This is something that we, the coordinating center, pitched to NIH as part of our proposal. So while we have these randomized trials up and going, we should also figure out how to use existing resources that exist to better plan and eventually conduct randomized trials, pragmatic trials. I've talked before about distributed research networks with this group. Recall that the real advantage is that there's access to data for sure, but because those data remain behind a data partner's firewalls, there's an inherent privacy and privacy built into the network. It works because everyone agrees to put their data into a common data model, into a standard format, so that tools can be developed and reused, and you begin to really get some efficiencies. Importantly, though, the data partners maintain control of the data and their uses. So for the Collaboratory, what we've done is to engage the partners in Sentinel and ask them to essentially pivot toward a research environment. As you may remember, in Sentinel, the distributed research network that supports FDA's post-market surveillance, safety surveillance initiatives, all of that work is done under the auspices of public health practice and exempt from IRB considerations. In order to leverage this kind of resource for the NIH, we had to address the research, the IRB issues and related regulatory issues. So we've expanded that network to include a few others. The Murdoch study, for example, we've brought them into the NIH Collaboratory Distributed Research Network so that becomes sort of a discoverable data source, a discoverable research resource for folks within the NIH. This just highlights the available data in the DRN as of right now. We did some supplemental, we did some work with NIH to actually run some queries that they wanted to run in this networks to give them an idea of how they could begin to use this sort of an infrastructure for their planning of funding announcements and even their planning of pragmatic trials that they're interested in doing. So that work is underway, and we'll be, I think, publishing some of that in the next few months. From the NIH's perspective, the distributed research network is useful because it really does support their research planning, and the questions that they asked were all directed toward that. But they're also really interested in using this to actually answer research questions. One of the folks we worked with at NIH in some of these, the query that we ran, when we produced the results and walked through the output with him, his response was, "Wow, we paid," unnamed research group, wow, we paid unnamed research group X million dollars to get an answer to this question, and you mean you got the answer with basically similar data in 2 or 3 months for, X divided by 100. So I think sort of the realization that for some types of questions and for certain types of data, there are more efficient ways to go about answering them. So, this actually, Kevin touched on most of these, so I won't belabor the point, but say that we have created many channels for dissemination of the work of the Collaboratory. I've mentioned the Collaboratory website, which is really a great resource for information about each of these trials, as well as the work that's being done to glean information and evidence about how to do pragmatic trials, and put that in a public forum. The website is well used. The big dot there is right here. The living textbook, I think Kevin alluded to the living textbook as well, which is actually, I think Adrian's going to talk a little bit about some work coming up with that. A little overhauls is in the works. And then, of course, Grand Rounds, which we hope many of you join. This is the shared form of the Collaboratory and PCORnet. Here I'd like to point out that the highest weekly attendance, I believe that mark was actually hit on a presentation about the Distributed Research Network. So I was very quick to point out to Dr. Califf that it beat his Grand Rounds. Great, let me turn it back to Adrian.
Yeah, so there was actually a lot of worries at the NIH that there'd be zero attendance for the Friday Collaboratory Grand Rounds when Rob left. And so we were pretty happy that we were able to maintain and actually grow attendance for Grand Rounds. I did point that out to Dr. Califf, and he quickly noted that he was sure that he could come back for a cameo visit to exceed any of our attendance that we've had before. So, and of course, we welcome that if we could get through the bureaucracy. So as we go forward, so we are at the midpoint, and this is actually a good time in terms of how we should think about the Collaboratory for the next 3 years. And we just recently went through an external advisory panel to kind of look at this from a very broad view in terms of the NIH Common Fund money being used wisely, and is there anything else that we could do? And so one of the things that they pointed out is that that there is a lot of knowledge being created there, and we actually are very fortunate to have these elite investigators and elite health systems to do these trials. These are all cluster trials that are done with really expert investigators. And so the two things were like, how can we even more so expand the knowledge base and disseminate that and to other investigators and other health systems? And also, how do we get new investigators, younger investigators, thinking about this? And so one of the things was really, how can to do even more with the living textbook? And so the team is going through kind of an exercise to kind of restructure it. So there are key topics that can be easily found, and have this in a structured format so that for these different perspectives, whether it's these ethics or regulatory challenges, etc., what are the things that can need to be considered and addressed, or a toolkit, if you will, for the design, the actual conduct, and the reporting of that. And so that's an ongoing process that's really just recently started up. The other thing is that now that kind of these first wave of trials are actually have transitioned from kind of planning phase to the execution phase, how can we get other partners interested in these concepts? And so really fostering the collaborations and connections within NIH across the different institutes and centers, but also through these other efforts, and specifically PCORnet and PCORI, as we think about this. And so there's going to be some meetings coming up to help drive interest and understanding about what this can mean, and hopefully engage further funding for this type of research. And we also recognize that in some ways, while there's been a lot accomplished, that really the tip of the iceberg has only been touched in terms of what's needed in terms of really getting this on a large scale across multiple investigators and research programs. And then specifically, as Kevin highlighted, it was very interesting to see that what's missing is kind of A versus B, which is the most commonly reported clinical trial. So, because I think people are very interested in understanding, especially when there's a new therapy, is it better than the old therapy that was part of the standard of care that's different than, say, just an efficacy trial? Or when you have two alternatives, what's the best therapy? And so if you look, for example, in the world of diabetes, where there's countless options for treatment of diabetes, but we don't actually know relative one versus another, which is better. How can we do that? And so we're hoping that highlighting this gap will actually generate interest from the NIH to, again, expand what has been done for the Collaboratory. And so I think there'll be a lot of interest in terms of how to unite healthcare systems or electronic health records addressing that therapeutic intervention type of question. So in summary, we'll answer questions, is that the Collaboratory should be viewed very much as a work in progress, and we really love to hear any ideas about what else should be considered in that framework. There's a lot of interest from the NIH to use that as a mechanism to try new ideas, try new concepts, or try to expand real-world evidence development through pragmatic trials. There is ongoing effort to translate those experiences into knowledge that can be disseminated through a variety of teams and approaches, and then again rethinking about how to disseminate that more widely. And so one of the things that the external advisory panel noted is that beyond these kind of tools and resources in the living textbook and cross-collaboration is, again, how can we have a forum that actually starts getting younger investigators interested in understanding what can be done here as well. So with that, we'll stop here and answer questions, and of course all the hardball questions go to Kevin and Lesley. Kevin and Lesley. I was just saying that's a hardball, so that goes to
So first off, congratulations to all three of you and the rest of the team behind you that's made this possible. It's an incredible amount of work, and it's very, very impressive to see it formalized. The questions are two. One is very specific and one is more generalized. The specific question is, you talked early on, those great figures about how much it costs per patient enrolled in studies. Is there a challenge with, you didn't give much in terms of the cost per patient in collaboratory studies. Do you have estimates of that? Do you think these systems will continue to enroll patients at a very, very low reimbursement per patient rate long term? Is this something that they're doing under this specific examples, and then will they continue? So the generalizability question. Question two is, assuming yes to that, or we can achieve that, there seems like an incredible number of questions that could be answered, and maybe this is even a question that others around the room have expertise on, but how do we decide which of these questions do we take on? Is it going to be NIH, a panel, patients, some degree of decision modeling, telling us which studies are most important to do?
Well, I mean, I would start by saying the answer to those two, it's very much related, right? So a health system's willingness to engage in this type of research is directly related to the question that's being asked, right? So I think the way forward that does require the health system to be engaged, to be willing to probably do some of that work, pony up to support some of the work of answering the question. And so then those two things, as I say, I think are related. We don't yet have cost per patient estimates out of the Collaboratory, but that's something that actually the collective we are working on, but not really. A Harkness fellow who's working with the Collaboratory is tackling some of that.
And that's been one of the things we've suggested to the NIH, is specifically addressing that value question so that people have an understanding of what the costs are. Just an example of where there's kind of shared costing is that So one of the other trials that was in the Collaboratory, they actually calculated the millions of dollars that HCA would saved from the answer. And so they went back to pitch to them essentially that BAIT trial, and they said, no, we don't want to do that, but go get your grant, and then we're happy to partner with you. So there's that issue. Carrie.
This was really great. Thank you. I wanted to ask you the question. You pointed out the void in your two-dimensional plot there with the A versus B, more traditional treatment comparisons. And I was just interested in your perspective as to whether the kinds of things you're doing to evolve systems for these pragmatic trials is, in your view, the right way to do these more traditional studies of drug A versus drug B, where you want to do a well-designed, double-blind trial, if possible. In that more traditional setting, is there a role in what you're doing for those kinds of trials?
So I'll start, and then Kevin, since he created that graph that causes that question. So for A versus B, definitely. And there are some examples where there have been studies where they've been basically designed based on formulary access. So essentially randomizing plans to a group of patients that has access to a drug that's because that's on their formulary, or that's their priority, or the copay is such that they wind up choosing that. So there are a lot of ways to think about A versus B in that kind of setting, just as an example. The blinding issue is a challenge. That's a real challenge. I mean, there's just that in itself is probably not easily considered pragmatic. But Kevin, you have the right answers here.
No, I'll just to say that these questions are exactly why we think we need to do more collaboratory work with trials of that sort, because there are so many significant methodological, ethics, regulatory, and analytic issues that arise, and we don't understand those well, and no one really understands them well. And so we need to get in there and sort these things out, understand the types of interventions that would be amenable to a pragmatic trial comparing two individual treatments, and so write your congressperson.
Harvey?
One of you will comment a little bit on the ethical issue, specifically the informed consent issue, and where it stands if one is actually doing a pragmatic trial that's comparing two accepted standard of care interventions.
Yeah, so it's a miserable topic. So we can say that within the Collaboratory, most of the trials have been able to get have been able to meet the minimal risk criteria and get a waiver of consent. But there's considerable debate within the bioethics community. There's confusion interpreting the regulations. There's draft guidance from OHRP on what sort of risks are created by randomization to accepted treatments versus just having your doctor pick one. And so the number of special panels and meetings in the last 2 years just on this question has been amazing. And so I think it's an area of continued discussion. Hopefully the revision to the common rule could address some of these things, but I've got to say there's some very weird thinking going on from some of our perspectives on high. So, from on high, not our thinking. Our thinking is solid. The weird thinking is on high.
Dan, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a great discussion. I wanted to come back to, I think, where Adrian started the talk, and it sounds like the motivation, and I've heard this sort of message in a number of different forums from the NIH recently, that they think that they're not getting good value for their trial money, that somehow this whole thing is just wasteful and inefficient and too expensive. And then they invent these sort of ideas that are completely untested, that, you know, if only you did electronic health records, everything would be much cheaper in data collection. Having been through that, and you've also done the Heart Failure Network, which is a very different kind of enterprise, but also in a sense attempting to develop common infrastructure and other things where there was supposed to be cost saving. I just wonder whether you know, and Mike Lauer's continuing to make sort of pronouncements from on high without having field tested a lot of these ideas, and it's kind of massive public policy experiments in the research space. I wonder, you know, whether that's really the best way. I mean, this is driving innovation, but it's also creating sort of panic and consternation and a lot of confusion.
Yeah, so I mean, I think people probably noticed that you know, recently the NIH got a $2 billion increase in their annual budget, which was the first time they had anything for the last 12 years. None of it went towards doing trials. So like they spend about 10% of their budget for trials. And so they're very much on the warpath of getting more for their money, and we see that from a variety of ways. I think Mike Lauer and others at the NIH leadership are actually very interested in the kind of research on research, understanding what are the barriers for use of pragmatic trials, what are the limitations for the kind of current infrastructure, how can you actually change that, how when you do a study can you actually understand where are those limits in terms of generalizability. But you know, when you hear from them, you know, where they say they look over their portfolio and they say about 50% of their trials don't get completed, and then when they do, they don't actually get the high quality answers that they're looking for, and then even there, they don't all get published. You know, then you start understanding their perspective. So, so I think there's electronic health records may be useful for addressing these things, but it's not sufficient because there are a lot of aspects in terms of study design and approach and the types of outcomes that are focused on that are agnostic to electronic health records. And I think that's one of the things that that has become apparent from some of the collaboratory efforts. Others comment?
I just wanted to add that it seems like it's the hope of our NIH colleagues that pragmatic trials would hold the answer to these types of concerns, but they also have a commitment to really trying to understand to what extent that can be the case. And I view where we are right now as in the phase of trying to understand how you would do this kind of study best. And the next thing, that, as Adrian alluded to, we're trying to push NIH on is once we figure out how to do them well, we've got to figure out what the costs are and what the cost drivers are and what are the value propositions to different stakeholders who could be financing these types of studies in the future. So some people might have unrealistic hopes of success, but a lot of the people we're dealing with at NIH are very committed to understanding the conditions under which these could be good solutions to the problem.
Maybe just one additional point. I think Kevin mentioned that there's been a real focus on asking the PIs to really share what the issues have been, where they've hit roadblocks. And the NIH has been very receptive to hearing that and learning about how this is hard and why it's not the answer to everything. So I feel like on that front, we have an open channel of communication.
And there is a commitment to try to help essentially define a decision tree when, say, this approach would be optimal versus, you know, under certain conditions versus why it's not optimal and something needs to be done. And that definitely depends on the question and context. So. Well, thanks everyone for spending your first day here.